Okay, cool. Hi, so I'm Oliver Braid. I know the majority of people here tonight. Okay, so my talk of insignificance, I've done it in quite a few different places. I'm going to do it in a couple of other places later in the year. Each time it's like in slightly different formats. So tonight we're going to go for like a sort of 60-minute format, and then maybe Matthew's going to ask me some questions, or anyone else can ask me some questions. But so yeah, as Matthew said, I live in Glasgow. I was born in Birmingham. I didn't always really want to be an artist. I used to want to be an actor. Until about the age of 13, when I decided that I'd become an artist instead. This is like for a variety of, one of the reasons is something that I guess sort of like keeps on recurring even now in my work, which is something to do with friendship and a certain kind of desperation for friendship, I guess. Like when I was in year 5, one of the things that we had to do was write a list of our friends, and then we had to write a list of presents that we'd get for them. And I remember at the time being too embarrassed. I didn't write anyone down for the whole session because I thought anyone's name that I write, oh, I'm not friends with them. So yeah, I was just too embarrassed to do it. And recently, like, my mom said to me, oh, you didn't really have any friends at school? And I was like, oh, I was friends with so and so and so. She was like, yeah, but they're all girls. So, you know, for my mom, that didn't really count. This is me in a ballet class. And around the same time, I guess I was sort of thinking that what I'd like to do most is be like, if not an actor, then maybe like a hairdresser or a fashion designer. And I was sort of like working on ways to sort of like explain that to my parents, I guess, from quite a young age. My dad, we could say, when I grew up, one of my dad's favourite things to say was that what I'd love to do is like get a barn and fill it full of gays and then pour petrol all over it and set it alight. And so like I was always thinking, like, oh shit, this is going to be bad, but maybe I'll just make it through till I'm 18 and then I can sort of escape somewhere. When I was doing drama classes, my drama teacher said to my mom that she was worried about when I went to high school, I might be a bit too fey for the other boys. But and I'm still not completely sure about the definition, but in my head, fey actually means psychic, and so I sort of mixed it up a little bit. But it turned out that like my drama teacher was actually kind of right, and I couldn't really do acting anymore. Well, for a start, my voice is a bit too weird, and like realistically, I'd be relegated to character. So we just gave that up. Around a similar time, my high school art teacher had this poster for Sensation in the art room, and she just graduated from the RA, and so it seemed quite exciting. So I persuaded my dad to take me to Sensation. So we went to see this art. I can't remember that much about going to the exhibition apart from thinking, oh yeah, I could probably do this. And I sort of remember my dad crawling into Tracy Emin's tent, which I can't remember whether you were actually allowed to do or not. But let's say I just have this image of my dad's head poking out of this tent. The Tracy Emin thing is kind of important in a way, because I did sort of think, oh, this is a really like interesting alternative way of expressing myself. But without having to get up on a stage or do any talking or anything, although, that's slightly changed. And then when I went to university, my mom was really obsessed with this idea of me going somewhere really safe. She's like, oh yeah, and then when I was offered a place at Falmouth, she was like really intense about it, like, definitely go there, definitely go. And I was sort of waiting to hear back from Brighton, but she was just like, no, don't go there. And so, in retrospect, and actually my foundation teacher at the time said, she's just sending you somewhere where there aren't any gays. And so, like, in a way, yeah, I mean, I guess that was sort of true. So for the 3 years at Falmouth, I spent a lot of time just sort of like sitting in my studio and, not seeing any other gay men, or not any that I would be aware of. But in my first year at Falmouth, the thing that I was sort of thinking at the start of art school was like that I had to find my thing. And I guess like that had come from seeing artists of that sort of like kind of sensation generation, or have these kind of very kind of identifiable things, like if you see a certain colour blue and some scribbly writing, you might think of a certain person. If you saw some spots on a white canvas, you might think of someone else. And so I tried lots of different things. We had to do a project in the first term, and everybody else just seemed to really get into it, and I was just sort of mostly making videos of myself just running against a wall, because I just really had no idea what I was doing, and I couldn't really understand how everyone else had got like this thing straight away. Like there was one girl who'd been on like a sort of a gap year to Africa, and so she spent her 3 years like stretching African fabrics and painting like starving African babies and stuff on it. Or there was someone else who pretty much just drew horses for the whole 3 years. So like, you know, lots of people came with their thing. And I guess like in my first ever tutorial or group crit, my tutor said like, well, there's lots of varied interests, but what it really comes back to is you. And so I was like, great, that's my thing, me. But it did sort of make sense to me, because the way that I thought people really reached like their thing in art is sort of something to do with developing a philosophy about lots of other things, which you then kind of internalise and then would come out of yourself in some kind of object. But I don't think that you can really like develop a philosophy and internalise it and make objects in like the first year of art school. But those are definitely the kind of things that I was thinking about. A really big problem for me, and for a long time, but I guess it really came to head in my undergraduate, was that I used to think it was a fear, but actually I'd say it was more like I just didn't really know how to talk to them. But let's say a fear of men, and like I was quite nervous around men, and so I didn't really want to have to go into any workshops or ask anyone to help me to like cut any wood or do anything like that. And so I sort of moved particularly into the world of the handmade. I just realised I was talking so much. Look, here's a sensation poster. I've missed a couple of slides, so let's see. Here's Falmouth. Let's see. This is what. Oh, this is me doing an artwork. You see, it's a performance from third year of undergraduate. Let's flick through. Okay, so yeah, we're up to speed. So I got really into making things with my hands because I was too scared to go to work. I do a lot of kind of sewing and collage and whatnot. And I also sort of started to think that the handmade is quite a nice way to talk about the idea that it's come from somebody, and like in some way that the maker is sort of articulated into that work. But because of that, and because of people saying, oh yeah, well this work always comes back to you, I began to get really obsessed with the idea that I was just a massive narcissist. And so like probably around my second year, and definitely a lot of my third year, I spent a lot of time sort of printing off information about narcissistic personality disorder and putting it into folders, thinking that at some point it was going to help me work out like what was wrong with me, but that didn't really happen. And so I guess from now and to of people, I guess, who have internalized philosophies and become kind of like, if you like, living artworks, I sort of came across Quentin Crisp for the first time when I was at art school. I was kind of frightened of Quentin Crisp when I was a child. I didn't know who he was, but I guess this kind of weird gender ambiguity combined with my mom turning off the television or something would have made me feel like he was kind of a scary person. So one of the things I really liked about Quentin Crisp is this idea, like he's quite flamboyant and he's doing his thing, but he doesn't necessarily want to interfere with anybody else. He's just sort of like closed off. And this indifference, this idea of indifference, I became really obsessed with when I was talking to people. People would say, like, do you want to do this or this? And I'd just be like, well, I'm indifferent. I thought it was like a really nice way not to offend people. Again, there's always this kind of paranoia of wanting to be friends with people, sort of underlying what I'm doing. But I came across this writer called Jonathan Katz, who's an American writer who did his PhD in the 90s, and he rewrote, or he reread the ideas of Moira Roth, who maybe you guys know, she's like a 1970s art critic, or maybe she's still an art critic, but I guess she was like at her peak in the late 70s. And she wrote an essay in the late 70s called The Aesthetics of Indifference, where she looked at artists like John Cage or Robert Rauschenberg, and she sort of talked about them as kind of gay male artists in a McCarthyite America, and she was saying like really, as people with power, they should have done more to like make a scene about things rather than just making silent music or blank canvases, white canvases. And so Jonathan Katz says, or he sort of rereads it. He's writing in the 90s, so he's very into queer theory, and so he talks more about this kind of silence as a sort of thematized absence, and how it's like a sort of passive protest, like this idea of like, I guess the way we articulate it is saying like, so he's saying that John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg would have seen themselves as gay men being silenced, and so instead of trying to do something about that, they would just thematise the silence so that they would give us a white painting or kind of silent. So the three things when I graduated from Falmouth that really I was left with, and now we call them the 3 A's, and one of them is anecdotal manufacture, which is like the idea that an object that is made also sort of articulates the way that it has been made in its final version. So, I mean, a really good example now might be everybody doing loads of blobby ceramics. And so, you know, we see lots of handprints around the ceramics and whatnot. The other one is aleatoric composition, which comes from John Cage, really, and like this idea of chance influencing things, or just like setting something up and then seeing what happens, and we just get what that is. And the third one was antagonism, really just because I was quite interested in this idea of the indifferent and how that can still really irritate people, like somebody punching Quentin Crisp in the face, even if he's just sort of walking down the street. So I graduated from Falmouth, and then I moved to Liverpool, and this is me at the bottom with an artist called Roxytopia. I moved to Liverpool, and I lived with a girl called Catherine, who I didn't know that well to start with. We'd been at university together. She had a job, and I didn't have a job to start with. So I was doing lots of art, she was going out to work. We were living in this flat, we didn't really know people apart from Daniel in the city. And in the end, Catherine's job stopped, and I got a job instead at A Foundation, which is like a gallery in Liverpool working for biennial. And in the end, Catherine went home, so I needed someone else to share the flat with. And so I met this girl, Roxytopia, and we were both working together at A Foundation as invigilators. And I guess anybody who's been an invigilator, is that like 75% of the room, maybe, knows that you've got like a lot of time on your hands. So we spent a lot of time talking. We both just graduated, so we were talking about work a lot. We were both kind of interested in antagonism, and both sort of in Claire Bishop's essay on antagonism. But we developed this new relational terrorism, which we would, well, it's aggressive artwork basically. We'd have kind of conversations while we were at work, just two people talking, and then we'd sort of develop these kind of fantasy exhibitions into like posters and modules, things like this. This is a poster for a homophobic, racist acid party where we get loads of homophobes and loads of racists together and everybody takes acid. And so, you know, they all have that kind of vibe to them. We were working in the main installation that we were invigilating was an installation by Goshka Makuga called Sleep of Ulro, and one of the other pieces of work that we started to talk about making Sleep of Goldberg, which is like, it's basically a miniature version of Goshka Makuga's installation, but all of the artifacts and everything that she used would be related to the career of Whoopi Goldberg. And from that, we were offered an exhibition to kind of make a full solo show. So then we just worked on that months in Liverpool, and the outcome of the exhibition was called A Proper Horror Show, and it was kind of things like sculptures firing blood over you, and like trying to persuade people to change their name to Adolf and stuff like that. I suppose the thing that I really took from Roxy is this idea actually that the art books in a way is sort of secondary to the kind of relationship that we were having, you know, of just talking in the lounge or talking at work, coming up with silly ideas, but then actually saying, okay, well, we'll make it into a real thing. And then while I was working on that show, I also went on my first residency, and I met this man here who's called Bruce Asbestos. Some of you might know, I mean, I know some of you know. And so I was making this work with Roxy, and on my own I was also making some sort of decorative pen drawings. And Bruce sort of felt that the work I was making with Roxy seemed really old. He was very bored of artists being negative, and he was very interested in kind of optimism and positivity and kind of ways to bring that into work that wasn't completely gross, that wasn't just making soup in a gallery or something. I came back from the residency, and me and Roxy made the show, and then I went home at Christmas, and I basically just decided that I didn't want to go back. So we drove back to Liverpool one day and I just collected all my stuff and I was like, oh, Roxy, I'm leaving. And then I just left. And so then I went back to live with my parents for like 8-9 months. And to start with, this actually seemed all right. Me and my mum were actually getting on okay. My dad was off the scene by that point. He'd gone somewhere else. But I moved back. These are some of my friends from my hometown. This is at a Big Brother 8 party. This was taken the night before I went to Glasgow. Oh, actually, sorry, it is Big Brother 9 because I'm there as Darnell Swallow. Yeah, and so that was the night before I went to Glasgow. I wasn't really when I was at home with my parents, and I was sort of worried because I knew I was going to Glasgow, and I was a bit like, oh shit, I haven't actually been able to work out what it is that I do. And I was a bit worried that I'd never really make anything again that was as good as what I'd made with Roxy. Around the same time, I made this kind of horrible solo show in Southport, which I never really show any pictures from because it was like, that was it really for me. I felt so depressed after I made that. I thought, I just really have no idea what I'm doing. It's a bit stupid of me to be going to art school. But then, luckily, my friend had a zombie birthday party. And so for it, I made this Facebook zombie costume because, at the time, because I didn't have anything better to do with my life, and it was 2007, so I was, really into Facebook at that time. But I show it because it's really significant because it was the first time for a long time that I got up and I really wanted to work on it each day, and I felt like I was kind of into this type of working. I think because in a way it was a costume for a friend's party, so I had this idea that I didn't mind making something as long as I was making something for someone, so I got quite into making birthday cards around that time as well, things like that. And I suppose from the things that Bruce had said to me about positivity, I began to think a lot more about pleasure and the fact that I was with my friends just doing these silly things. And I felt like for a long time art had to the things that I was doing had to have some kind of really meaningful thing, but actually then I began to think how this could be sort of meaningful in itself. There are two sort of things that I really hooked into at this time was when I wore this costume at the party, everybody else was a zombie, but nobody else was in a cardboard costume. And I felt like a little bit as if people were embarrassed because I'd made too much effort. And that feeling of embarrassment, because I've been talking about indifference for such a long time in my own life, I did start to worry that I didn't have any feelings. But when I felt embarrassed, my bum cheeks would always clench. And so because it was a physical reaction, I knew that there was something about embarrassment that was making me physically react. And so it felt like, okay, well, even if I don't have any other feelings, I know I have this one because it has some kind of manifestation in my body. And I suppose also the thing that I was kind of into at this time was the difference between camp and snark, both of them having some kind of confusion with irony. I'd been listening to a lot of Alanis Morissette again because I was back at home, and me and my friends would sing it a lot, and then I sort of think, well, there are kind of situations where I'd be alright to sing it, and I know that the way I felt about Jagged Little Pill in 96 isn't the same as how I feel about it in 2006. Like, I sort of feel a bit more like not so serious about it, but I could still enjoy it. But then if ever I played it in public, I'd feel really embarrassed, and I couldn't listen to it without sort of making a sarcastic comment about it or kind of trying to be like too cool for it. So I guess there's this distinction between knowing something fails in its seriousness and still feeling warm about it, or having something which fails in its seriousness and then sort of taking the piss out of it. And I guess the former is really what I thought was much more interesting, was to be really into the things that you were into and to be honest about that. And so finally, like, I was about to go to Glasgow, and so I started to think more about my materials. My mum's a primary school teacher, and so I really began to think about this kind of the use, how those kind of materials had come through into my work, and their relationship to this idea of being like a learning tool or some kind of like learning device, and then mixed with a kind of homemade protest So yeah, lots of things made out of funky foam, cardboard, things like this. My mum was driving me up to Glasgow, and on the way we were going to Liverpool to drop off some work for a show. So I'm moving to Glasgow that day, and my mum was like, "Oh, what work are you taking? What work are you dropping off in Liverpool?" And it was a piece of work called Shit Cunt that me and Roxy had invented, which was like 2 hats that was about how much feces you could fit into a vagina. And so my mum was like, "Oh my God, this is such a waste of my money. I'll just buy your house in Kidderminster. Please don't do the MFA." But that didn't happen. I decided to go to Glasgow. The thing that I was quite interested in when I first got there to GSA to start my master's was friendships, and the friendships that I'd had for the kind of previous 9 months when I'd been at home with my parents. So these are 2 of my friends, Nancy and Sally. I suppose, when me and Roxy were making work together, we would have a conversation that was sort of like an in-joke, and then we would develop something from that. So I sort of started to try to replicate that this is called Crude Harmony, and it's about a singing game that we invented in the car, but none of that information is presented to you, obviously. You just get the drawing. And so I wanted to do this thing again where maybe you see a group of friends and maybe they're having a good time, but you're on the outside of it, you don't necessarily know kind of what's going on. And so I guess kind of how that can feel slightly intimidating. Again, I suppose I was trying to make an object, hey guys, I guess I was trying to make an object that's kind of like indifferent still, or has some kind of level of indifference. So it's like there's something happening in this work, but it's, you know, it's not really telling you that much about it. And the other thing that I wanted to try and get is this idea of a silence, in the same way as a kind of John Cage silence, but one that's non-minimal, because I'm in Glasgow, so I don't want to make loads of minimal things because everyone just thinks, oh yeah, well you just make Glasgow artwork. So I tried to do something that more over the top, I guess, if you like, or something that looks like the way that silence might look if it came through the internet, where you just get so many images, so much information that it begins to like just sort of flatten itself out. This is an object that I made. So I wrote an essay called The Socratic Challenge in my first year, which began to sort of try and give my work like a position of what it was that I was trying to do. And there's a couple of points. The first one, I sort of returned to Claire Bishop and looked at antagonism again. But I sort of twisted it around a little bit because I felt like actually the things that were really antagonistic in the essay were the things that she sort of had a problem with rather than the things that she was praising. So I was quite interested in these like Rick just sort of work, like how annoying is it to go to a gallery and someone offer you a bowl of soup, and in comparison to how annoying it can be sometimes if someone's trying to be really nice to you and they end up just really alienating you. So yeah, I started to think about that a lot, and I went back to this idea of Jonathan Katz and indifference and the passive protest. And finally, I discovered this thing on the internet called resistentialism, which is like a fake philosophical movement from the 1960s. I think it was first written about in 1964. And it's really the idea that objects are against us, you know, like toast always falls, brakes hit you in the face, stuff like that. As if an object would be that bothered about humans, but this was before like the quadruple object or something, so it's still alright to think like that. And finally, I returned to Quentin Crisp. Particularly, like, I guess that this kind of, oh, right, well, that's got nothing to do with it. We'll come back to that in a minute. Quentin Crisp, there's a quote that I use a lot. It's on my website, so if you've been there, I'm sorry. I'll just say it again because I think it's useful. And so he's talking about night classes, and he says, if you're going to learn how to sing or dance, that's okay, because people who learn how to sing will always have richer, rounder voices, and people who learn how to dance will always have bigger, bolder gestures. But as for pottery or basket weaving, what good are they? Because as soon as I'm in an institution, I might get into an argument with a stranger on a street corner, and I'm left saying I can't express myself, you'll have to see my baskets. So I really like this idea of, like, you know, what happens when we present someone with an object if it's not that helpful. So from objects, I sort of began to develop a little bit. Objects I was sort of describing at that point as a static artwork that articulated a social situation. So then I tried to reverse it, and we went the other way into the world of projects, which is more like a social situation which creates artworks. So this is one of them. This is the first project that I did actually. It's called Jamie Radcliffe, the exhibition. I was really obsessed with this boy called Jamie Radcliffe, who was like from my hometown. And I tried to add him on Facebook and he declined me. But he did add my friend Sally. And so she gave me her login details. And so I made a PowerPoint of images of him and things that he was interested in. And we sent it to 69 different artists that I'd met over the last few years and asked them if it was either about him or about my unrequited interest in him, and we call it the ultimate romantic gesture. So yeah, Jamie Radcliffe. I'm going to go back. This is the object that I'm talking about. This is called Predictions, and it's an ashtray for smoking with your best friends. So you kind of, I guess, you sit around and smoke spliffs, and then this top is interchangeable with different kind of fantasies that you have when you're stoned that like seem like they're significant, but they're not. This is about a boy who is 11 and he wants to go to Hogwarts, so he cuts his head open with a razor blade, but then actually he's just left kind of bleeding. So Jamie Radcliffe, after I made Jamie Radcliffe, I also made a documentary about Jamie Radcliffe, and I also made a film where me and two of my friends from school tried to recreate the craft in a 2-week holiday. But actually we just ended up arguing a lot. We did get about half an hour of it done, but then there's an awful lot of arguing. So at this point I had kind of objects and projects. And my problem with projects after I did them was that I realised they weren't really indifferent enough. It was like they gave too much, because in order to understand Jamie Radcliffe, the exhibition, it felt like there had to be a text that says like, you know, this was the process by which we came to this. And with objects, whenever I present them, there's another problem in that they're slightly too indifferent, because like, well, you know, what's that? So at the end of my MFA, I decided that what I'd do is try to combine objects and projects. And some of the image quality is very bad, okay, I'm sorry, but, this is a drawing that I made for my MFA degree show, and it's the first combination of objects and projects that I tried. It's a drawing of 5 boys that I used to see around Glasgow School of Art who were on the undergraduate course at that time, but I'd never spoken to. I quite fancied them, so they're sort of my top 5 attractive boys. This is all the glue that had come out of my glue pot for 2 years. And this is sort of Jamie Radcliffe begging bowl. So this is the start of an object, but then after that I made friends with each of the 5 boys. And then for a year, I would go and hang out with them, keep diaries, we'd log it onto the internet, these diaries, and then images were provided with the texts. And each of the texts for each of the boys, the website was password protected, so we invited 5 different artists, Sam was one of them, who work in video and film, to make films in response to my diaries. At the same time I made objects for them, and I worked with a curatorial team to design a room, so when it was shown at the Royal Standard, it looked like a big boy's bedroom, like 3 rooms, and it just smelled of links all the time, so someone would walk around spraying links. And you'd see the films, you'd see the objects, you could look on the website, there's all these different ways of interpreting the work in that way. Also, I just graduated from the MFA, and I was living with my friend Ellie, who was already quite a busy artist, whereas I was basically just sitting in my room every single day writing applications in a dressing gown and feeling really sad about my life. One of the things that I'm not really blamed it on, but that I was conscious of, is another Quentin Crisp quote, the idea that living in the future is the death of happiness. And so you can't be happy because you're going to do something, you can only be happy because you're doing it at that time. And that really, for me, this is about 2010, which is like, I begin to think of it as like the peak of positive psychology or something. Lots of influences that I was taking in that seemed to resonate with that Quentin Crisp text, like these kind of ideas of mindfulness and well-being. And so while I was sitting in my room, I was doing like a gratitude diary every day, and I was trying to do all of these things that would keep you positive. But really, I guess the problem for me is this idea of being an artist and thinking like, oh my God, maybe I'm going to get the show, and when I get the show, I'll be really happy. But like at the time, you're sort of so busy like writing applications or being a desperado, that you don't, all you're thinking about is that future thing, but then actually when that comes, you're probably doing something else. This is another funny sculpture that I made at the end of the MFA. This is just about lying on the beach and getting stoned. It's a bit of a mix with Shirley Valentine as well. It was because we did it in Berlin and I felt like we should have a kind of holiday theme. Okay, and then I graduated and I began to combine objects and projects, and then the first two because my 5 New Friends actually was made public a bit later. The first one that I made, this is called Love Made Easy, and I was for a long time I've always been thinking, sometimes you meet someone and you fancy them and then you see their work and it's really bad and so you can't fancy them anymore. And the same, like sometimes you can meet someone and then you see that their work's great and they become really attractive. So I invited 20 single artists to make artworks or to submit artworks, and then we built this installation here, and then the opening night, 20 artists for the preview did a speed dating thing, and it was watched by the audience through this other room, and the audience were playing a sort of shag tag game at the same time. The second thing that I did, that was my attempt at giving back, and offering opportunities for other people to find love. This is a drawing that I made with another artist. This is from a project called I'm 26 and I Have Nothing, because that's what my mom said to me after I graduated from the MFA. And for this is all about me, really. So I just invited another artist that I was attracted to come and do a residency in my studio for 6 weeks. And in that time, we'd produced drawings together. We were working with BBC Scotland at the time, and so we made the drawings, and then BBC Scotland made a little film, and then at the end, they auctioned off the drawings, and we were supposed to use that money to pay for a really extravagant for us to go on, because by that time, in theory, we'd have spent so much time working together that we would have been in love. Now, this goes back slightly to expectation, and so again, I suppose I'd had this thought that because I'd imagined this thing happening, like we were definitely going to get into a relationship, that I wasn't really kind of reading any of the actual signs that someone wasn't really interested in me, which turned out. But I think a really good example of it is, well, from this exhibition, which is slightly about this book, completely about this guy that I was obsessed with. Okay, so in Scotland there's a gallery in Edinburgh called Collective, and every year they run an open call called New Work, well, it used to be called New Work Scotland and now it's called Satellites, and it sort of has this thing like a kind of new contemporaries type thing where you apply and they select like 3 people and then they give you money and you make a show with them. And so for like 3 years I've been wanting to do this, like applying every time, thinking like, oh, come on. This year, 2011, I got an email saying that I'd been selected, but on the same day, I got an email from this guy saying that he didn't ever want to see me again. And so, again, there's this kind of idea of thinking about something in the future and how great it's going to be, but then actually when you get there, on that day, you get a really shitty email at the same time, so you're kind of distracted again. So this idea of like projecting into the future, I'm not really the kind of I guess I know art. My friend Denise, for example, is the kind of artist who she will draw something, a sculpture or something like that, and then she's like, okay, that's it. And then like 3 months later, she's made it and it looks exactly the same as it does in her sketchbook. But I've never really been able to do that because I always come up like, well, there's loads of stuff I can't do with just my hands, so I have to like learn how to do things a little bit. But I'm kind of interested, or at this time I was kind of interested in this parallel between human relationships or forming a human relationship and then putting expectations on it, and then the idea of maybe making an artwork or wanting to make an artwork and putting expectations on that. Also, I mean, given the context that the exhibition that I was making was in an open call situation, I feel like this idea of expectation weighs very heavily on this. This is an installation from the exhibition. The exhibition ended up being called I'll Look Forward to It, which is taken from a Skype conversation that me and this guy had, where I say, I'll look forward to it, we're talking about meeting or something, and he gets really angry because he thinks it's like a passive-aggressive way to try and like force him to meet me. At this time, like, because I've been revealing information for a long time, or like, I uploaded all of our Skype conversations onto the collective website, and I invited, I came to Studioville to do a funny little residency, and while I was here I organised this panel of like experts in positive psychology, and we looked at all the failed applications for that year's New at Scotland, and we chose 5 new people to give like a second chance to, if you like, and so we chose them to make an exhibition in the space, but they had to make an exhibition or an artwork that was based on text that I'd written about the ideas of expectation and happiness, which I guess I would contrast. Like, happiness is when we're just like lost in the moment doing whatever, and optimism and expectation is like when we're desperately clawing at trying to do something and thinking that it'll make us happy, I guess. I also made, for this exhibition, so we made this group show. It goes into 2 rooms and there's a lot of texts. There's downloads on the internet. This guy's name was everywhere, all over the project, which turned into a bit of a problem. And I also invited like 5 musicians to write songs for him. And finally, I made a Christmas window display, again, also about expectation. And so there's a poem in the centre of these eyes, which is the poem I wrote about expectation, that's been animated and illustrated, and then there's these 2 eyelids, and they're hydraulically powered, so they go up and down like that during the Christmas run, reading this kind of sad story of expectation to find happiness from something that goes wrong. Unfortunately, I was sort of wondering when I made that project whether this guy was going to maybe like it, might work, he might be interested. But unfortunately he wasn't, and to this day he's still never spoken to me, so we'll talk about what happens in a bit, but basically I began to look for like reasons why this had gone wrong, why this project hadn't started to really work for me, and I thought one of the reasons is maybe like sometimes there's this kind of discrepancy between what I think is serious and what other people think I think is serious, and so actually maybe sometimes it looks like a joke, even if I am sort of trying to do something kind of meaningful, if you like. After that work, I felt very sad for a very long time because I really felt like I'd done something bad to this person, and so I couldn't really or but instead I started a radio show with my flatmate Ellie Harrison called the Ellie Oliver Show, and we did it every Friday at 12 o'clock for 1 year, and we talked for half an hour about a different subject. The other thing that me and Ellie also made at that time, as Matthew said, was this project called Artists Anonymous, which is like an experiential therapy group for artists. There were 12 of us and the counsellor from Glasgow School of Art, and we did it at CCA in Glasgow, and we'd meet once a month and talk about the things that I guess affect artists, like feeling poor or feeling desperate, or feeling like bitter or jealous or something like that. We'd talk about all the bad emotions, and it was kind of like quite a cross pool of artists at different stages of their career, so in lots of ways it was kind of helpful for me. Because as I said, I was feeling quite sad after I looked forward to it, but I had to make another project because I was invited to make something for Tramway, and so I made this project about going bald, and it's called You'll Get Used to It. It's slightly about going bald, and it's slightly about having your expectations dashed and having to get used to it. And also going to see an artwork that you think is very strange and you don't know how to eventually, over time, you might be able to rationalise it. And I suppose I was thinking like that's the same kind of thing as losing your hair. Like to start with, you begin to think like, and then after it takes so long that it's just like, you get used to it. And after that, I started to make future resolutions about the type of work that I was going to make, because I guess after I looked forward to it went so badly, I just felt like I didn't really want to make artwork about another person again. That didn't mean that I couldn't stop thinking about this person. And basically, like, I think because this person wouldn't speak to me at all, like, and sometimes I would just phone him like maybe 30 times in a row and he wouldn't pick it, like I was quite nuts. And it's a bit like when you have thoughts and then you don't really have a real object to put that thoughts to, so that object begins to become something, I guess, quite different to what it is in reality. I don't know if anyone read those Eugene Thacker books, but in the second book of Horror Philosophy, there's this bit where he talks about Kant talking about depression as being similar to like a thought without an object, and I guess I sort of feel that as a kind of a practical thing. Kant's kind of vaguely important at this point because basically in the end I just couldn't take my mind off this person or feeling guilty, so it's like I'd come to work and I just couldn't really do anything. So I thought the best way to fill my mind with something else would be to learn something really complicated, because I've never really done any kind of philosophical work before, if you like, but I knew that Kant was really difficult, and I thought if I just learn something really, or try to learn something really difficult, my mind will have to be really full all the time, distracted from thinking about other things. So I started to read quite a lot, and I'd just be sat in my studio. This is my, well, it's not my studio anymore. We'll talk about that. This is my old studio, and it's based, like basically this bit here is the communal area of the studios, and this bit behind this screen is my studio. So it wasn't really working, but I was sitting in there a lot and kind of reading or listening into other people's conversations and getting really irritated with them, just being like, oh, please let me do some work, something. The reason I got this studio originally, I didn't pay for this studio, it was given to me, was when I made Love Made Easy, I did it at this kind of gallery studio place called Iron Brats. We'll talk about that name in a minute as well. And so this is me in my studio looking really happy. Basically, I went for an interview at Iron Brats previous, God, I haven't said that word for such a long time. Iron Brats. I went for an interview at Iron Brats a while ago, because they were in about early 2011, before I did the show there, to try and get a marketing manager, because you got a free studio, and I was sort of thinking, okay, well, I'll slightly not do any marketing, but I'd really like a free studio. I didn't get the position, unfortunately, but then the person they did ask turned out to be even crappier than me, so she left and I got offered the job at Love Made Easy. So I moved into the Iron Brats studio. As I said before, my job was marketing manager, and the problem, well, the first problem before anything, apart from the fact that I can't really be bothered to use Twitter or any of that stuff, is the name Iron Brats. It had come from two people's names, Jessie Ironside and Amanda Dobrats. They put it together. Now, I've probably spent the first 6 months of my job there trying to persuade them to change the name and saying, like, this is really the problem. Or actually, I can't use a Twitter account that's got that name attached to it. It had a Z and 2 B's. I thought it was too much. But as a compromise, I started to do this thing. I said, well, what I'll do is I'll write a weekly blog called The Only Way is Iron Brats, and we'll just talk about things that happen in the studio, like when we have, this is 2 cheesecakes filled with ice cream on the top. We used to have like a cake Thursday. And so I'd do that, and I'd kind of write about stuff that happened in the studio, and that was fine. But luckily, the woman who ran Iron Brats, I think, was quite frightened of me in a way, so she never actually asked me to do any work. So for the first like year and a half, I wrote the blog sometimes, but if I couldn't really be bothered, then I didn't. And no one really said anything, and I'd just hide in my studio if I heard her come in and think, oh, I bet you won't come in. But in the studio at the same time, like lots of other people had moved in around the same time as I had, including these guys called Pigeon Perfect, who are 3 people that I was really... We'll talk about that. And they're very responsible and very businesslike. So when Amanda, who owned Iron Brats, announced that she was going to move to America, I was like, shit, who's going to take over and still let me have a free studio for not doing any work? So I persuaded Pigeon Perfect that it would be really good for kind of their business portfolio and like for them if they were to take over as the managers, and then I would continue doing my job. And so we signed a contract and everything was fine. Amanda left, Pigeon Perfect took over. And the first thing we did, which was great, was enlarge my studio. This isn't my studio, by the way, it's another room, but it's the only one that I could find of us doing some kind of manual work. So we enlarged my studio, and Pigeon Perfect took over. It turned out that they were really keen for me to do some actual marketing, unfortunately, and there was only so far that I could push just being friends and not really doing a lot. So I had to start doing a bit. But my main problem with this job is this idea. When I showed you before the picture of the cake, and I talked about Cake Thursday, this was something that we did together, and we had a really fun time doing it. But I was never the one photographing these things. But it was thought that should have been that actually, you know, we don't just have fun with people and have nice relationships, because that doesn't really matter, apparently, unless it's been put on the internet, has been tagged so that lots of other people can retweet it and we can all see like what a great time we're having. So in a way, like, my role as marketing manager was to share relationships again, which is sort of what I sort of vowed not to do after that last time. So there were some tensions between us. I was very pro not sharing, and they were very pro sharing. Fortunately / unfortunately, that year they were also represent Scotland at Venice for the architecture biennial, and so there's this idea. Well, basically, it looked, that's not true, that they were right and I was wrong, and that sharing was the way to go. And I guess because my studio was near the kitchen, I was sitting near the social space, and I had to listen to people discussing all their ideas all the time. And in my head, I was always thinking like, wrong, you're wrong. But there's nothing that I can do about it. I'm their employee, and I'm, you know, they're much more successful. So I was like, fine, whatever, man. I just decided that I wouldn't bother anymore if that was what it was going to be like. So I started to just kind of like not bothering to do anything, particularly like to do with idleness. This is the last episode, I think, of The Only Way is Iron Brats before it got cancelled because I did something a bit naughty. But we'll talk about that towards the end. So I started to read kind of things like Bertrand Russell on idleness, or kind of Hakim Bey on poetic terrorism. This kind of new research is very much about doing stuff, and maybe doing stuff with other people, but not really kind of doing it to be seen, just doing it because actually it's a real pleasure to do. Around that time I was invited by a short presentation about, well, whatever. And so I wrote this talk called The Certainty of Insignificance, which is obviously from where the title comes tonight, and so it's been about since 2012 that we've been doing it in different varieties. I'll just recap 3 key points really tonight. We won't do the whole thing. So the first point really is this idea that like you might have kind of status anxiety or sort of worries like about whether your actions are going to be significant in the world. And then there's this, I sort of borrow a structure from Pascal's wager to say that actually it's much more likely that your actions are going to be insignificant, but that doesn't have to be a bad thing, like that's actually possibly a positive thing. I suppose what I wanted to say was that this new boring, let's have a little, oh here, look, there's Hakim Bey, that's me in my studio. The new boring, oh, what am I saying? Sorry. So, it's much more likely that your actions are going to be insignificant. And so I was worried at the time, I guess, that kind of statement would sound a little bit like what The Guardian were calling the new boring. And they were sort of relating it to things like Downton Abbey, Brown Brogues, Adele. They were saying like all of these things have been put into post-recession Britain to make us all calm down again, like by kind of boring us, if you like, into submission. But so I don't want to say just because your actions will be insignificant, it doesn't matter, and it's not part of the new boring. In fact, it's actually more similar to what Jan Verwoerd calls exuberant existentialism, existential exuberance. He gives the example of SpongeBob, who fries patties all day at Krusty Krab. But he fries patties because it's his favourite thing to do, so he's happy while he's doing it. He's not doing it instrumentally. It's just like, you know, or well, I don't know if SpongeBob is SpongeBob's favourite thing to do, but in the essay, Jan Verwoerd used the example that he does it because it's his favourite thing to do. So there's a sort of, I guess, like, rather than saying it's boring, it's just like you can do something that's just interesting to you. And the reason that would not be boring is, again, from this Quentin Crisp idea, a new idea of Quentin Crisp's, the party at the end of the world where everybody's talking and nobody's listening. And so what I'm suggesting with Certainty of Insignificance is that if you do enough stuff that's interesting to you, hopefully you would bore other people into doing something that was interesting to them. So everybody was doing something that was interesting to them and mattered to them, rather than everybody just having to watch one person. Paradoxical. So at this time, I became really interested in seriousness that year. When I was doing the Ellie Oliver Show, I was talking about seriousness a lot. And one of the things I was listening to a lot was Lauryn Hill's MTV Unplugged album. I don't know if anyone knows that album, but it's very sincere. It's very sincere. Do you know that album? Sorry, don't ask. So, but there's 12-minute tracks where she just talks for 12 minutes about God and her beliefs and the things that have happened. And I guess I bought that album when I was a kid after The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill came out and expected something quite similar. And when it wasn't what I got, I was just like, oh my God, I really couldn't take it very seriously. It seemed like too over the top. But I began to think that year that maybe it was just really sincere, and I started to find it really beautiful because I thought everything that she was saying was so sincere. And because of this discrepancy between what I think is serious and what other people think I think is serious, I decided that I would try to be really sincere that year and make really sincere things. So I made this sculpture that's behind us now, which is called Sincerity Shoe, and it's like a mix between a trainer and the ghost of Lauryn Hill sort of floating, and it was presented outside a room where I did 3 talks, which is where I met Matthew first. But unfortunately, 1 week before I did the talks, Shoe, Lauryn Hill went to prison for tax evasion, so there was it was harder to talk about. When I came back from Liverpool after doing that performance, I sort of ended up with a boyfriend. Quite weird for me, and I guess I became really interested in this idea that I spent a lot of time thinking about stuff, but when I was kissing this guy, I sort of began to think, oh my God, well, I wasn't thinking, that's the point. I was like, whoa, it's like I'm not thinking when that's happening, it's more like I'm feeling. And so I guess I became quite interested in this difference between thinking and feeling. These are some braids frozen. And I guess I equated thinking with this kind of rational approach that I'd always done of writing. When I wrote things like Love Made Easy or I'm 26 and I've Got Nothing or My 5 New Friends, I was writing, when I wrote them as proposals, I wrote them based on a GCSE science handbook. So you'd have an aim, hypothesis, objectives, things like that. Basically, I decided that was one of the problems with my practice, and that I would try to be more irrational, although I don't, so basically I decided that I wanted to do something irrational. And around the same time, I was invited by CCA in Glasgow to make an exhibition in their upstairs gallery in response or as a sort of companion piece to their main exhibition, which was called Economy. So I started to make this project about the economy of information and about removing some of the personal details from my work and what would happen if I presented people with things that didn't have all this kind of biographical stuff with it, and you come and there's some things in front of you and you're just stuck with those. So I made this exhibition at CCA. Originally it was supposed to be called Irrational Conclusion, but I just thought that sounded so insanely rational. And then one night I was in bed and it came to me that it would be a great title to call it Snorlax Beanbag, which is what it's called. The colours are off here, but the back is more like a Snorlax green, and then these screens are the same colour as Snorlax's stomach. And so I was thinking about the role of Snorlax in games as someone who sort of sleeps in the way of levels, so you can't get past him unless
what is Snorlax Beanbag? Sorry.
Well, a Snorlax Beanbag is a real thing. It's a beanbag in the shape of a Snorlax from Pokemon. But for me, I guess the name came to me before I really worked out what I thought I might say it was about, and I began to, Snorlax for me is this kind of sleeping antagonist. On Pokemon, apparently he sleeps in the way of the next level, and you have to find a flute to play the flute to wake him up, and then he'll go away and you can move on to the next level. Beanbag, well, I really love the idea of a Snorlax beanbag, basically, but also I like this idea of beanbag having this kind of 70s, very comfortable, easy living vibe. So there's this idea that there's a big Snorlax and he's in the way of this potentially comfortable space, which is a bit like me blocking the information. So the exhibition had drawings which were illustrations to the Certainty of Insignificance, and then 2 objects, and then these belly screens where the works would be hiding behind. When you first come into the room, you don't see any of the works, and then as you move around, you see them. Last but not least, I'm at the end. I'm hidden behind the last Snorlax belly, and me being hidden was kind of like this perverse Vito Acconci piece, but without any masturbation. Like, I'm just sitting behind a bit of wood. But then when people came round, I guess there's this idea that because it's the artist invigilating, if you wanted to know some more, you could actually talk to me, but you'd have to talk to me to get that information. So you'd have to play the flute, if you like. Although actually that sounds really naughty now. I should have really exploited it a little bit more. After I made Snorlax Beanbag, basically the day after the show finished, I deinstalled the show, packed up my room, me and Ellie did the last Ellie Oliver Show, and I moved to France the day after or something. And that was to do a residency for 3 months in Marseille. When I was in France, I got this review sent through to me of Snorlax Beanbag. I was a bit broken-hearted because I thought it was brilliant. I mean, obviously I don't care about other people. But anyway, this guy gave me 2 stars, which is fine, right? Give me 2 stars. I'd rather it was 1 or 0. I think that's much better. My problem really was in the review that he'd written, the 2 points that he picked out that he thought were particularly problematic about the exhibition. One was, given the playfulness of the exhibition title, it was shockingly antisocial. But like, I was sort of, for me, that's a positive thing in that light, but not for him, obviously. And secondly, there's this idea in the review, he talks about that I'm sat there, but then afterwards he says that it's really weird that I've just done all this stuff and then not presented any information. So I found it a bit irritating because I thought he got the basic components of the exhibition, but like there maybe hadn't been this complete putting together. But you know, it's tricky when people just don't tell you anything. So yeah, I went to Marseille. This is Marseille. And I had 3 months, and I was still. So I made Snorlax Beanbag, and that was like the first time where I thought, this is new work where I haven't exploited anybody. I want to sort of develop this. I went to Marseille basically to read and to get some new ideas. For a while, actually, before I started to read Kant, one of my friends, Denise, she was really saying to me like, oh, you have to read some object-oriented ontology. But you'll need to know about Kant and Heidegger beforehand and stuff. So I'd sort of been building up to that, and I thought, right, I'm going to go to Marseille, I'm going to read loads of object-oriented ontology. I also read some Freud, which is quite a weird mix. But mostly what I did was eat loads of pizzas and get a bit of a bad cannabis habit. Like, by the time I left Marseille, I was smoking like, well, about 70 euros of weed a week, and now I'm smoking about 100, but I'm cutting down. I'm not stoned at the minute, by the way, just in case. The things that I thought about a lot, though, while I was smoking was this idea of withdrawal, that I guess is like a word that Graham Harman would put a lot. And also I thought a bit about this idea of the crystallized branch, this kind of idea of, and I guess relating back to this guy that I was so obsessed with, even though I didn't have any contact with him. It's like I kept accumulating all these layers, and the way I was doing that, I think, was by kind of trying to excavate and trying to work out what had gone wrong, but from a point of view with someone that I couldn't actually have a conversation with and find out. I was sort of just kind of making guesses at that. The other thing that I did when I was in France, well, I made this funny drawing, and I wrote a new project, but it's never been accepted by anyone yet, and I've been sending it off for like 2 years. Talk about it too much, just in case anyone's ever into it. And it's slightly about, well, I guess it's a mix. It's to do with Leonardo da Vinci and rereading Leonardo da Vinci in the 21st century, and how that might alter my Quentin Crisp question about the relationships between objects and people. But I keep thinking that I'm going to be confident enough to really talk about the idea, but then I get really worried that it's so brilliant that someone will steal it off me, so I just keep quiet about it instead. I went back to France. I left France, and I moved back to Glasgow. I've moved out of Ellie's house. I lived with Ellie while we were doing the radio show. I lived with her for 3.5 years. and we're really best friends, but she's also quite nuts, or I'm really messy and she's really tidy, so I didn't want to go back there. And I had to go to bed at 11:30 every night, and I wasn't allowed to use the toilet after a certain time. I only had to book to use the kitchen. Like, I'm quite a relaxed person, and so for me it was a little bit too much. So I moved here instead. This is Wasps, which is like a studio provider. Luckily, Ellie is the studio manager, and she was like, oh, the flat is free. So this is an old 1950s cigarette factory, and on the top there's a manager's flat on the roof. So I live on the roof now of this factory with officially I live with one of my friends, but I actually live with two because we're subletting, because it makes the rent an awful lot cheaper. And so I moved back to Wasps, and I started my job again at Many. I'd had a 3-month sabbatical, and I think that they'd hoped that I'd become a bit more sane. Oh, sorry, I say Many, that doesn't make any sense, because Iron Brats, while I was away, had rebranded to Many in celebration of how, like, we love to reach out to people and work with, you know, as many people as we can, as long as we can photograph them, put it on Instagram. And I also went back to work at the Burrell Collection. I work at a museum in Glasgow 2 days a week. It's like a kind of, it's an old collection of lots of different things. But a new girl had started to work there called Daniela, and I'd seen her around town, like, before. She'd be at openings and stuff, but I'd never really spoken to her. But then we used to get the train back together, and it was on the train that she started to talk to me about sigils a lot, and because she was really interested in kind of psychonautics and chaos magic, things like this. And so, yeah, she was very interested in the sigils. So, like, I feel embarrassed saying it in front of Scott because we've talked about it so much. Well, I've seen Scott do a sigil, but the basic idea is that it's like wish magic, and you would want something, so you would write "this my wish" and then write what you want, and then abstract the letters till they become a kind of graphic symbol to the point that you don't really necessarily remember. This is this is an H.P. Lovecraft. This is like the sigil of Cthulhu or something. So you'd make an abstract symbol, and then you'd kind of burn it or get rid of it, and then you'd charge it in some way, like you could have sex while looking at the symbol, and then you'd destroy it. Or you could do this thing like Austin Osman Spare used to do, like you could make the death pose, and that would charge the sigil. So there's this idea in the sigil that would be about, do you think no?
No, I'm just...
All right, okay. I thought you were just like, that is wrong, Oliver. So, as Daniela explained to me the sigil, I guess there's this idea that you make something and then you try to sort of forget about it, or you get rid of it, and that's how it does its work. And because I'd been reading some Freud while I was in France, I started to think about it in contrast to the way that Freud talks about the rebus, like the kind of picture puzzle, the dreamer's picture puzzle. So we're given something and then we take apart the elements so that we can decode some kind of message that's hidden beneath it. The rebus is sort of, I think, the way that I was taught how to make art, especially when I was on foundation. There was always this idea that the artist is like a puzzle maker, or somebody who builds their ideas into something, and then that thing is then looked at by someone else who picks it apart and then derives some kind of meaning. Because I really don't want to be in this business of excavating personal details or anything anymore, I basically became a lot more interested in the way that the sigil functioned, and that actually thinking about what it was supposed to do would actually retard it from doing kind of what it should do, like the magic that it should do. And so I was invited by printmakers to produce a new exhibition upon my return from France. And so I planned a sigil exhibition, and I thought, well, I'll make a sigil. And I kind of basically done the whole installation in my head again, like I'd worked out everything that was going to happen. And then I was thinking, like, it was so weird because I haven't heard from Edinburgh printmakers for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then when I did finally get in contact with them, it turned out that an intern had just got onto the emails and just emailed me about doing this project, and I'd just been having a conversation with an intern. No one else knew anything about it. Like, I'd been given a budget, I'd been working stuff out. And so, there actually wasn't anything, but I guess if you're an intern, that's the kind of thing that you should be doing, just to mess around with people a little bit. So I was a bit irritating because I wanted to make this sigil. Luckily, around the same time, Pigeon Perfect, who now own Many and were my boss, they were invited by Book Week Scotland and the Scottish Book Trust to invite 5 artists to make 5 public murals celebrating the world of reading. That's Edinburgh. Here is the library in Buckhaven. So Book Week Scotland wanted 5 artists to go to libraries and make public artworks in libraries or around libraries. There was quite a big commission for it, so you know, I need cash, how can I say no? This was the building that I was given. They really wanted me to work on the gable end of the library. But basically, when I went for my first presentation about what I wanted to do, I sort of said that I kind of think that like public art is a bit like magic, in that it might only work if you really believe in it. So I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a sort of sigil for the library that's in the form of a charm bracelet that will hang around the roof of the library. I'd been making some more kind of black and white drawings, and my plan was to kind of blow the drawings up to big scale and then have them pasted onto these big acrylic charms, and we'd build that around the library. But unfortunately, that wasn't really what they had in mind, and that was kind of where the problems started. This was my... Basically, they said, you can't put anything around the library top, that's out of the question. So I said, fine, we'll just reduce the size of the charm bracelet, and we'll put it here. We'll do a little circular mural here, and then we'll do this big, because they gave me each artist had to illustrate a text, and mine was about reading being a form of transport, which is why I made these kind of transport charms. They also said, well, we have to have a Book Week Scotland logo, so it's like, fine, we'll make our planet, whatever. So I thought, right, fine, that's fine, it's not ideal, it's not really what I wanted to do. Then I get back and they say, hang on a minute, you can actually only go up to this 4-metre line on the wall. So what they were hoping for was something that goes up to here and then just like a big nothing. So I wasn't really into that. The problem was, manager Mark from Pigeon Perfect, the guy who'd invited me, and we were really good friends, he was in his boyfriend at the time, so I'd be like, Mark, all of this is happening, and he'd be like, oh, I'm in New York, so I can't really do anything. So I was left to deal with it myself. At the time I was reading Lanark by Alasdair Gray, a section in it where the main character is commissioned to make a mural, and it goes really horribly wrong because he's so nuts about it. And this is kind of like the first instance in this project of like synchronicity, and it seemed like, God, it's so weird that I'm reading this at the same time as this is happening. So I was like, fine, I don't know what I'm going to do because I can only go up to the 4 meters, but we'll work something out, it's okay. And then they sent me another email saying, actually, it doesn't matter what you've thought because you can't actually make this artwork until you've had a community consultation. And you have to work with a community group to help make the work. And so I said, fine, I'll work with anyone who's got 7 years worth of art school education, because I think, like, if I was a scientist and I was doing an experiment, you wouldn't just want to put loads of people in there and hope that it was all right. I suppose I sort of felt that if the people who wanted this art to do something really believed that art did do something or was capable of doing something, then they might be a bit more cautious about like who kind of, you know, got involved in doing that thing. So because I said that, they had to send someone to my studio for a meeting to talk about the problems. And luckily, when the lady from Book Week Scotland came to the meeting, she'd brought with her a lot of ideas of murals that I could make, which is useful, I think. And that included, one of them was a big wall painted with patchwork fabric and then images of local community members on it, which she thought would be really nice. Now, I think she could have done that herself rather than invite someone else to go to the trouble of thinking on it. The other idea was that I could paint local buildings and landscapes that people would recognise, and obviously that's lovely as well. I was really insistent on doing a sigil. I was like, look, we're really going to do this sigil project. How are we going to do a community workshop? So I said, fine, we'll do a sigil workshop. I'll just teach everyone how to make sigils, and then we'll work out how to display that. And the lady said, oh, that's great. We'll get them all to do sigils, and then we'll do a book in the library where people can look at all the sigils, and then next to it we'll write what the sigils are supposed to mean. And I was like, well, no, because that's completely going to stop them from working. It would make them meaningless. To which she said, not as meaningless as a load of abstract squiggles. So for her, I guess, kind of meaningless has to be articulated in a way that everybody can have access to. Her final suggestion to me was that there are a lot of dolphins in the local area. It was near the sea, and she was saying, wouldn't it be lovely we have some dolphins painted on the wall, because maybe some boats, something like that, beautiful. And then I said, well, what's interesting in the world of the sigil is that we arrange matter in space, and then it passes through our consciousness into our unconsciousness, and then something happens. So why doesn't anything happen when the wind blows 2 leaves down the road? Because it's still arranging matter in space. Well, it's because there's no consciousness. But dolphins have a sort of sentience, I believe, and so I suggested to her that perhaps the bad vibes in the area that I was supposed to solve had maybe accidentally been caused by the dolphins moving stuff around in the water and not really knowing what they were doing. So actually the best community workshop we could do is we all go out and kill loads of dolphins in the bay. Now, I'd already said to her at another point that only 17% of people had lives worth living, which is a Kurt Vonnegut quote, which I thought she'd appreciate being a book person, but she actually really didn't. Apparently she went back to the office and cried, which I do feel a bit bad about. I did send her a card to say sorry, but I did send her a card with a pig on the front in roller skates, and I was a bit worried that she might do roller derby or something, but hopefully she doesn't. I've never heard. I also sent her a Facebook request, but she never accepted me. A couple of days after that meeting, I woke up and I had an email telling me that I'd been fired for having ideas that were meaningless and for insulting the community, which is fair enough, I guess. But I was a bit like shit, because part of the project that I'd organised involved loads of other people. I had people coming from Germany. I had all these people whose, their tickets were all booked. All of that was paid for by Book Week Scotland. Luckily, Book Week Scotland also said to me, out of goodwill, we'll still give you your fee. So I was like, okay, great. I can probably just do another version of the project. I just need to wait until that fee comes through. So I just kept it really quiet for a little while. That day I did a tarot card reading, and the kind of thing that came from it mostly is this idea that judgment was coming. So I got really frightened, and so for that period I just kept repeating to myself, judgment's coming, judgment's coming, judgment's coming. The money went into my account, and then I started to release the information for the event that I'd rearranged. That was when I was being abused, sorry. And that's a drawing that I made that would have been one of the sigils, or would have been abstracted to be one of the sigils. There's some dolphins. Here's the event. So this is my event at Transmission. It's called Communal Dolphin Snouting. It's basically all of the elements that would have happened at the library, but they've been relocated and a couple of things have been added. So for that event, I did a talk about the commissioning process and what had happened. And then Daniela, who introduced me to the sigil, she did a talk about chaos magic, so that people sort of kind of felt like that we were all on the same page. And then Berlin Philosophical Football from Berlin. And what they do is they divide people up into 2 groups. They have a muse who chooses questions, and the 2 people have a philosophical discussion along a subject that the muse talks about, and there's a referee who awards goals and red cards and yellow cards for different things, and then we see who wins the philosophy match. The groups were divided this time into community and individuals. Usually when Berlin Philosophical Football happens, they also pass a spliff round, so there's this spliff going around all the time, so you're getting more and more stoned while you're talking about it. This is one of the things that I wanted to do at the library as well, and that had already kind of caused a problem. Unfortunately, in Transmission, we weren't able to do it either, but it's just like by that time, I just think, well, we just have to, do the best we can. After the philosophical football match, there was then a rap battle performed by some Glasgow rappers that I'd invited, and then finally there was a poem read out, which was the match report of the philosophical football match. Also in the exhibition, which you can see, or in the event, which you can see at the back, is a kind of homemade version. It's quite dark there, but it's kind of a homemade version of the charm bracelet that I would make with the objects of transport going around it. It's just kind of like, it's this green thing here, but it's kind of difficult to make out. And so, so there's this thing. When I was putting up the charm bracelet in the day when we were building it, the helicopter charm kept falling off the wall all the time, and I had to stick it on. We got Velcro, stick it on. Eventually it stays, and we do the event, and then the event finished about 11:30 at night that night, I think. And when we came upstairs from transmission, there was loads of police around outside, and it basically turned out that a police helicopter had dropped out of the sky, like about 2 streets away from us around the same time, and had smashed into this pub, killing a lot of people. So yeah, it took me a really long time to include that as part of my talk, because it seems a bit wild to sort of make this link between my cardboard helicopter and this helicopter, and then kind of like, I guess, what things can do, or what, you know, like whether magic has any actual currency. So, but the thing that I did begin to think is like, well, what went wrong? Because my sigil wasn't to crash that helicopter. So either magic works and something happened that made something go wrong, or it's completely disconnected and it's completely random. So arranging matter in space, I've been thinking for a while about, you know, this kind of very basic idea of like quantum theory, like when you observe something, then you kind of freeze it, or it affects something. Or this idea with the sigil to kind of try to keep on thinking the thing that you're trying to do when you're supposed to forget it might be the thing that had retarded it and made it go wrong. So I started to think like, maybe it's because I was doing it in front of an audience, and there's this audience seeing the project and at the same time trying to work out what my intentions are. And so maybe that excavation of intention, of artist intention, was what made the work go wrong. So from that angle, which posits things as connected, I guess I'm trying to think of ways at the moment that if that side of it is true, I could disconnect the artist from their actual work. And one of the things that I'm sort of been thinking about for the last year maybe is the ad hominem fallacy. And so the idea that, you know, just because something comes from a bad person, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. And I'm quite interested in how you might apply the ad hominem to kind of art making. And that's something that I'm working on kind of in the future. The other option, however, is that the two events, the cardboard helicopter and the crashed helicopter, aren't connected at all. This is the mural that Book Week Scotland got in the end because they commissioned somebody else, and I think that this is much more what they were, you know, into. Yes, about 2 weeks after the helicopter crash and after the event, the other thing that happened was my friend had an exhibition that evening and we were helping her install, and then my mum phoned and said, your dad's died. And so I went to get some tobacco from the shop, and the thing I saw was a newspaper that said dad dies 14 days after copter crash, because some other dad who'd been involved in the helicopter crash at that time had died. But anyway, so there was this synchronicity, but if anything, again, it made me think more that this is synchronicity rather than there being any connection. And I suppose going down this avenue of saying either it's connected or it's a random occurrence, if it's a random occurrence and things are disconnected, then I suppose that that's something that I'm much more interested in from this point of view of talking about withdrawal. The other idea of saying things are connected for me seems much too closely related to ideas of unity, which I think are a little problematic. To give a real life example of a sort of unity, the guy that I was really obsessed with when I was making the I Look Forward to exhibition once told me he had a dream where I'd turned up to meet him somewhere and I had pink socks and black sandals on, and he was really mortified. And I began to think, oh shit, yeah, it's terrible. But actually, I was thinking that if you were to dress in ways that just match and really fit together all the time, I was sort of thinking that in some way that's a kind of aesthetic, not necessarily a protest, but it's complicit with the idea that things match or that things go together. And actually, because I don't really see that happening in the real world, I think like maybe I swing more towards, well, recently I made a post called Piss Off Unity, and so yeah, I mean, I suppose towards the end of that I was definitely very anti the idea that things would be connected. And then after that happened, I was invited by Glasgow, which is a festival in Scotland, to make a new project with my friend Mark, who's from Pigeon Perfect. We'd made up by that time because we didn't speak for a while after the mural commission. But we were going to do this project about gays and how they love magic. It was going to be called Homo Culture House. And we basically worked on it for like 3 months without signing any contracts. And all the time we'd be like, oh, Glasgow, when are you going to pay us? When are you going to pay us? And then they'd be like, oh, blah, 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 we can't really. And we were like, what? And then we went for another meeting and they were like, I just think it's a bit gross when people expect to get paid for what they do. And I was like, and then we did all this financial research to try and find out how much the actual festival got and what they were getting paid, and it was quite a discrepancy. We made a little complaint to Scotland about it, and the team at Glasgow were so annoyed with us that they just fired us without talking about it anymore. So that was my second firing. Then, just zipping back to the Only Way is Iron Brats, this is a guy called Alan. He's a studio member, and I guess he's one of my friends. But we have a bit of a weird relationship. We moved into studios around the same time as each other, but he didn't really do a lot. And because I was always sat in the communal or just near the communal space, it felt like he was just always in my studio, like asking me what you're doing, or sort of like looking over or talking to you. And eventually I found out there are two ways to stop him from doing this, and one was sneezing, because he really hated the sound of sneezing. But the other one, which is a lot easier, is to try and grab his bum or to try and grab his crotch. He really didn't like that. So I just chased him around trying to do that, if he tried to get into my studio. And then I guess we developed a bit of a relationship like two kind of naughty brothers that annoyed each other. But then one day I thought it would be really funny to go home with his phone. And so I was talking to him and I was on his phone at the same time, thinking, oh, he'll notice. And then he didn't notice. And then I left the studio and I was like, oh, it's all right, I'm out of the studio now. And then I was in town and I was like, okay, I'm definitely not going back. I've got your phone. And then I got home and someone else phoned me and was like, Oliver, have you got Alan's phone? I can't believe you do that. And I was like, oh, shit, yeah, I'll just take it back tomorrow. And it turned out he was actually really annoyed with it. So I took his phone back. But then the same day, I stole his computer mouse for 3 hours because I was just like, I couldn't resist not being told off a little bit. But unfortunately, after that, that was like maybe the third or fourth time that Alan had made a complaint about me to the office. And so, unfortunately, I was also fired from many in the end. But it did solve my problems of like sharing. And also meant that I didn't have to be involved with Unity anymore, so just move back into my flat, never see anyone, then there'd be no one that I could harass or offend, and I'd just do my own thing. And so finally, like the thing is, I don't really think that I just find things really problematic and then just moan about them. Like I'm actually quite interested in sort of making interventions into the things that I find problematic. And so in kind of the end of December last year or the start of January this year, I got an artist bursary from Creative Scotland and I got some other funding, and I started to produce a new art space, which will open in September, which is my art space. And it's based on it's reflective of the problems that I found at many, but it's called Phew, but spelled P-H-E-W, like as in like, although I've made a beautiful logo with the letters that say few, and then if you turn it around, the letters say many. But that's my only reference to an inversion, but I think it's quite funny. But the problem with that is that we won't be advertising few, because I'm much more interested in doing things that are really interesting. I'm not so fussed about the other people having to see them or think they're interesting. So at the moment we're working on a marketing strategy of how we might market Phew without really telling too many people about it. So I've been doing different sessions with people where I've casually mentioned it. So I guess like I say it tonight. The Herald, the Sunday Herald, which is like a Scottish newspaper, coming to my house soon to take a photo of me for their Sunday supplement for this article called My Favourite Room, where they go to people's houses and they just take a picture of the room you like. I've been decorating my house to become the art space, so my lounge now looks like a spaceship. The kitchen's like a medieval forest, the hallway's Mr. Blobby themed, and eventually there'll be all these different themed rooms, a little bit like Crystal Maze. But the main advertising is basically Phew has everything that an artist-led space has. It It's going to have an exhibition, although it'll only exhibit one work. It's going to have a reading room, it's going to have an archive, it's going to have a community engagement project. I'm actually in conversation at the moment with Stinson Hunter, the paedophile hunter. Hopefully we're going to bring him up to Glasgow to do a community engagement project, because it seems like, that's the kind of thing that people who like community engagement projects would really think, this actually does something in the world. Finally, there's an off-site project for Few, but the off-site project is a project by me, and it is downstairs in the studios downstairs. So it's an off-site project, but it's actually just down the stairs. And that will be called The One Where We Wonder What Friends Did, and that is going to slightly look back again at the 90s again, and relationships between people, especially artists, and the way that they work with people, kind of between 1994 and 2004, which is the run of Friends, the TV show. So at the minute, we're in the process of building a massive big monk's head with a wart on the top that looks like Margaret Beaufort, and then when you walk inside, you're in a sort of weird version of Central Perk with all these artworks that look like they're made by other people, but actually they're just forgeries that I've made myself, because I guess I spent so many time working with other people that now, it's just all about me. That's the end of my talk, guys. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Matthew.
That was great.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Oliver? Straight off. I have a question, or kind of. There's so much stuff to start unpacking. So I was thinking, this actually goes back to the first talk that we hosted at the Bad Vibes Club by a guy called Daniel Oliver, and he was talking about some research he was doing into antagonism in participatory performance. So. And conviviality. So you mentioned like soup in the gallery or that kind of stuff. And he was talking about this phrase, so agonism. So not quite antagonism, so not making people kind of hurt or dislike what you do, but kind of that space where it kind of moves back and forward, or it's just more ambiguous. And I wondered if there's something. So he used the example of David Hoyle. Do you know David Hoyle?
Yeah, quite actually. David Hoyle made one of the videos for My 5 New Friends.
Oh, right,
actually.
okay, amazing.
He described me as a spoiled middle-aged child. Not middle-aged, middle class. Even a spoiled middle-class child. Now I'm a middle-aged middle-class child.
But he often does these things that start off as attempts at antagonism, and then end in these weird kind of embarrassing convivial situations. So he goes to a petting zoo and starts talking about how zoophilia should be made legal, and then ends up having this really beautiful moment with these children who give him a necklace.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that, and then what actually happens is this agonistic situation where it's kind of confusing, you're not quite sure what you're meant to feel. And it strikes me that some of your older projects start with an attempt at conviviality maybe, and then end in antagonism, or end in this kind of more agonistic phase. What do you think something like the Few project, is that aiming for conviviality, or is it aiming at antagonism? Or it's
not aiming at conviviality.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily really aiming at antagonism either. But it is like the thing is, there's no way that I can remove the fact that I worked for many, and that the reason that I don't work there anymore is because we had so many differences, and so it would seem strange to me now to completely remove it from my life.
So, and this is, I think, central to.
I think for me it's something about gratitude still.
Okay.
I went to like a therapy session the other day, and we were talking a lot about. It was an artist therapy session actually called Psychosculpture. It's run by someone who lives in Hackney and 2 other people, but they were in Glasgow, and they were talking a lot about the idea that a lot of my projects come from kind of stuff with other people. Then it kind of includes, but it moves on from that. But I guess they were sort of saying that it's almost like a sort of strange honouring, like because the people who like start the conversation off or start me thinking, I guess I think there was a while last year or maybe the year before where I was really interested in this idea of the bardic tradition, like Alan Moore talks about it, the idea that words were magic to start with when other people couldn't write, because if you wrote something down about someone and the other person couldn't read or write, then you'd sort of effectively trapped their persona throughout the years in that piece of writing. And so I suppose there is still something about the bardic tradition in it, but I guess I don't really want to upset people, especially, I mean, there have been times where I wanted to in the past, but I would like to have conversations with people about why they get upset. And I think sometimes when I can't have a conversation with someone about something, like if they close down, then that's maybe when I want to just go a bit further.
And at that point, are you interested in the conversation reopening, or are you interested in making this kind of object from it, or a show or whatever?
Well, I think that there can be different things, because there's the conversation that goes beforehand, or the situation that is before the project is like instigated, but then during the project coming into being, there's lots of other conversations with lots of other people. But quite often the reason I'm making those projects is because it's got to the point where I can't have a conversation with the other person. There have been people in the past that have returned to speaking to me, but I would say I'm still not so much, but there was a real patch where I was getting blocked from Facebook left, right and centre by people because they were so frightened that if we had an argument I would use their information or something like that. And even some people that I'm friends with now have me on, they're friends with me, but they have me on private setting, right, yeah. Which I find a bit frustrating, because it's really like I was doing that 5 years ago, 6 years ago. I'm a changed man.
But this stuff really is still
really.
But this stuff really still affects you, because when I put this up on Facebook, there were lots of problems because you'd taken an image from Jamie.
No, I'd been sent a screen grab of a tweet of the guy from I'll Look Forward to It, but a very recent tweet. It basically happened the same time that Matthew invited me to do this project, and it said something about, well, it was about me being a sociopath, and I just thought it was really brilliant comment to use as a way to set up this evening. And
with this ad hominem kind of...
Yeah, this idea of a bad person maybe being able to do a good thing or something. So, but what I would say is, as a nod towards being a changed person, I did actually kind of blur out his details. But then after I put that up, one of his friends got really involved and got really angry about it, so we had to change the cover photo. So we changed it to this other thing that said, sorry, I did have this thing up that said I was a sociopath, but then somebody that got involved that isn't really involved, like a big old queen, so now we have to do this. And so then I thought that was fine, and the guy that got involved said, yeah, I am a big queen, blah, blah, blah. So I was like, okay, cool. But then it turned out that actually we had to change it again, right, to something much more friendly, and that's why the Facebook event now just has a picture of Doug and his friends around, although I think Matthew was worried that I'd snuck a secret message in there somewhere. Yeah. But I'd love to tell you that
it was really interesting, this piece of work that was, like 3 or 4 years old now?
Yeah.
Not only did it create problems, particularly for you, but it also created this really strange situation where it exposed all these cracks in the institution that I'm involved in, which is Open School East. So I'm kind of an external person, and I come in and run these things. And it created this situation where I think one of the directors got phoned up in the middle of the night, the ex-director who lives in Glasgow. On a bank holiday weekend, I'm like speaking to someone on a Sunday about changing a Facebook profile, and exposed these like real weaknesses in the institution, which then the current associates, it kind of sparked a conversation with them. And I think that's like why I was so interested. I mean, I didn't know it would happen, but like that's why I'm so interested in this stuff, because it kind of starts exposing the contradictions in people's kind of...
I mean, I think there was the other problem as well about the biog, and that's still not really resolved. Like originally my biog on the Facebook says all this stuff about me, like I did these exhibitions, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end it says, recently he was fired 3 times for sexual harassment and theft and something else, I can't remember what else. It said something else really bad about me. But then there was some guy writing in, was he saying he was going to do a public shaming campaign of Open School East if that wasn't taken down? Or like. But then I had to write to him to apologise and to explain the situation, and actually we sort of had quite a nice conversation in the end, because I
think this again, this thing where like something that was a joke, and maybe I'm not I think
it's like it's not really a joke, but it's like that the tweet, as far as I know, the tweet is like was put out in a public forum, and like who was the guy in the office earlier on? Mark. Mike, so you know we were having that conversation about like using an image off the internet and whether you're allowed to use it and stuff. God, I think anyone should be able to take a screen grab, especially if it's about them, and use it.
Well, it does give like a. There is a complex question here of like who kind of morally owns, or like what you're willing to do in, you know, because yes, stuff on Twitter is like public and therefore it can be used kind of publicly, probably under fair use or something. But then you did make this kind of ethical decision where you're like, oh, I don't want to go back into this kind of antagonistic part of my practice, and therefore I will change the image. And I think it's interesting because stuff like that throws up all these ethical decisions that just didn't exist before, because you didn't have access to everyone's images of them on holiday or whatever. And so I think, I guess like why your practice is kind of interesting to me is because you're like confronting these things head on. Like, you know, the breakdown between art and life for you seems to be still quite important, or not the breakdown, but like the kind of permeable borders between it. Whereas other people might just be like, okay, I got 5 for sexual harassment, I'm not going to mention that.
Yeah, no, I think it's so weird though. And well, I mean, whatever. I mean, it's just part of it would come out eventually anyway. I mean, the other option is that you tried to cover it up for 20 years, and then somebody prints it in a tabloid paper or something. Like, well, do you know?
Yeah.
I mean, whatever. And it's, I mean, also, I mean, this whole thing about being fired for sexual harassment is sort of also like, you know, I was fired in that way, and it was kind of convenient to fire me because of those things. But actually, it's really about lots of other things. But it's kind of more provocative, I guess, to say sexual harassment.
Does anyone? Sorry, I'm kind of hogging the conversation. Has anyone got any more questions for Ollie?
I think it's quite difficult because if someone just barks at you for an hour, like their whole life, it's like well, I mean, what questions could there be? I've tried to cover everything.
It's pretty. What's the word? Consistent or coherent?
Well, yeah, coherent. People do say that at least I'm coherent normally, so that's nice. It's like I think I've definitely like got a trajectory, even if that trajectory is a bit naughty sometimes, but you know, we're getting better.
Okay, alright, we'll leave it at that.
Floor.
Do you feel like your artwork is helping you more now? Or is it more like a space where you put your interrogations?
I feel like I'm putting less pressure on my artwork to help me, and more like I'm doing my work now. You know, it's saying this idea of doing something because you really like it, or because you're into it, or like having an exhibition in your house and then not necessarily inviting anyone, but doing it because you think doing it is really worth doing. So I guess before, and especially up to I Look Forward to It, I was always thinking very instrumentally about my work. Like, I won't make work unless it's going into an exhibition, or unless I'm getting money for it, or, you know, some reason. I'm not just going to sit there and do a drawing. Whereas over the last couple of years, I've become a bit more like, maybe it's really nice to just sit in your room with a pen and paper for a long time and just spend it doing a drawing. And maybe for it not to be seen. Although actually they've all been exhibited, but you know, I'm trying to pretend. Well, there's the idea. I'd like to get to the stage where I could say that I was doing something, and even if I wasn't going to be exhibited, I'd still be doing it. I don't think I'm there yet. I still lust after attention, but I'm trying to get better. I'm definitely trying to reinforce that idea in my mind that it doesn't matter. I would say that originally my art, I was trying to use my art as a way to help me, because I felt a bit like, well, what's the point of me spending all this time in a studio on my own when I'm not learning any social skills? So I use my art as a way to like help me get to know people better, or help me become less scared of men, or like all of those things. Whereas now, I guess, although the art is still coming from my personal life. Sorry.
You're just making baskets.
I'm just making baskets. There is actually potentially a wicker basket, honest to God, but it might be too far. We'll see what happens. We'll see if it needs it to get that kind of medieval vibe.
Any more?
Just wondering if this talk is a way, you know, like I really enjoyed the talk, and just to impressed by how much energy you have, and like the energy you need to kind of combat antagonism is it's such an exhausting thing to do. Quite brave. I just wonder if this talk in a way is kind of a cathartic way of combating that antagonism.
There's a way in which it's like, if someone does something nasty to you and then you tell loads of people about it, you feel a bit better because you're like, oh yeah, I'll just expose you for being a bastard. It's like, there was a way in which that's like something that I was definitely thinking about at some point in my life. But no, like this talk for me is like I said before, I've been doing it for a couple of years in different formats. And so the thing I guess that I'm interested in, but I haven't really arrived at that point at all yet, is to do with this idea of the ad hominem. And I suppose like I'm trying to find a way in the future to be able to do a talk where I talk purely about myself and how I've affected my work, but then at the same time I create a situation where the audience only can think about the work and don't need to think about myself, even though that's the thing that's mostly pushed onto them. So I guess like I'm building up to that, and each time I do the talk, like I rewrite little bits of it, or I talk about different bits. And like last time I talked a lot more maybe about the ad hominem and different versions of it. But yeah, so the real reason I'm doing it is sort of like to work out how I can achieve that status of giving myself and then asking people to completely ignore everything that I've just given them to focus solely on the work. Okay. So it's like that. Yeah.
Sorry, is anything sacred?
Is anything sacred?
Yeah.
It's really weird, right, that you should say that. But recently, because I'm really happy at the moment, it's like basically as soon as I left Many, or like just around the point that I left Many, just as I was getting into that, I got a really nice boyfriend and I sold loads of work and then I got loads of money and everything just seemed to really fall in place. So recently I've been thinking about all the things that I love and don't really want to do without. And so I guess like, but in terms, well, it's interesting because that man there in the black at the back looking down the chalk, hi, that's my boyfriend. And we're going to be making an exhibition together next year. And there are some ideas that I floated that Jock is not so keen on. And one of the things that we talked about the other day in this therapeutic session was this idea of like when to leave something alone, or when there's a point where you think, shit, this would be a great art, this is like the artwork that I'm supposed to do because I can feel it in my stomach, versus making trouble, I guess. So let's see what happens in January, February time. Keep an eye on Vane in Newcastle and see what I make, and you'll see like, yeah, we'll see. But yeah, let's say Jock, my friends, cannabis, and making things in my bedroom, my sacred things. Oh, I'm buying lots of clothes that I can't afford recently. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Thanks though for everyone for coming and listening. We're actually finishing on perfect time.
Oh, yeah,
really perfect
good.
time, 9:30. A really nice time.
Okay, let's say thanks, Ollie, again.
Thank you.